Evelyn Reed did not lower her voice. She did not lean in. She did not whisper. She did not have the decency to even pretend she was being polite. She stood in the aisle of Ascend Air's first-class cabin, Louis Vuitton bag swinging from the crook of her elbow, and she pointed, actually pointed at the young woman sitting quietly in Suite 3A and said loud enough for every passenger in the cabin to hear, "I want her moved, right now. Someone like that does not belong up here." The flight attendant froze. The cabin went silent. And Maya Clark, 19 years old, sketchbook open across her lap pencil, still in her hand, looked up slowly and met Evelyn's eyes without flinching. If you've ever been judged the moment you walked into a room, if you've ever had to sit still while someone tried to make you feel invisible, stay with this story until the very end. Subscribe to our channel right now and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The flight was supposed to leave Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International at 9:45 in the morning. Gate B22, Ascend Air Flight 117, non-stop to London Heathrow. The airline prided itself on being a different class of travel altogether, not just in the literal sense of first versus economy, but in its entire philosophy. Ascend Air had been built on a founding principle that luxury was not about exclusion, it was about elevation. That was actually the word printed on every boarding pass elevation. And on this particular Tuesday morning in October, the first-class cabin of their flagship, A380, was as close to that promise as anything that flew through the air. Maya had been one of the first to board. She always boarded early when she could not because she was anxious or eager to claim overhead bin space. But because those first few minutes in a seat before the noise arrived were the only time she could think clearly. She had her sketchbook out before the seatbelt sign was even illuminated. She had her headphones around her neck, not in her ears, just there. A habit and a cup of green tea on the little side table of her suite, still steaming. She was sketching a woman's hands. Not anyone specific, just hands the way she imagined them older-veined, holding something that might have been a letter or might have been a leaf. Maya worked in graphite first, always. She never started with color. She believed you had to understand the bones of something before you could give it life, and that belief showed up in everything she did, not just in her art. The suite was beautiful. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. She'd flown a handful of times before, twice for family travel when she was young, once for a school art program trip to Chicago. But never like this. Never with a door that closed, a seat that became a flatbed, a menu printed on thick cream cardstock. She had touched the menu when she sat down and laughed a little to herself quietly, because it felt absurd and wonderful at the same time. She had not paid for it. That was the thing she kept turning over in her mind, not with guilt, but with a kind of complicated gratitude she hadn't fully sorted out yet. The gallery in Mayfair had arranged the ticket. Her show, her first real solo show, 22 pieces, 2 years of work, opened in 4 days, and the gallery director, a woman named Priya Menon, who spoke in complete sentences and had the kind of focus that made you want to sharpen yourself just being near her, had insisted. "You are arriving as an artist," Priya had told her over the phone. "You will arrive like one." So Maya had arrived like one. Gray hoodie, neat braids, new sneakers that still had that faint squeak when she walked on polished floors, and a carry-on that held more art supplies than clothing. She was 19. She had been painting seriously since she was 12. She had been told she had no future in art by a guidance counselor at 15, told she was promising by a stranger at a coffee shop at 16, told she was extraordinary by Priya Menon at 18. And now she was here at 35,000 feet, or close enough, with a sketchbook and a cup of tea, and 4 days until the world was going to see what she'd made. She wasn't thinking about any of that, though. She was thinking about the hands. That was when the noise started. It wasn't loud at first. It was the particular kind of noise that a certain type of person makes when they believe the world owes them its full attention and they're irritated that it has not yet delivered. A clipped, sharp exchange near the forward galley. A voice that carried. Maya didn't look up right away. She heard the words reservations and my husband and something that sounded like a complaint about a bag tag. And she kept her pencil moving because none of that was her business. Then the voice got closer. And then it got specific. "Excuse me." The words were aimed. Maya could feel it before she looked up, the way a sentence can have a target before it's even finished being spoken. She raised her eyes from the sketchbook and found a woman standing at the edge of her suite, hand on the partition, looking at her the way people look at something they've decided is out of place. Evelyn Reed was the kind of woman who had spent decades cultivating the impression that she had always been exactly where she was standing. Her trench coat was camel-colored and perfectly pressed. Her hair was set in a careful silver wave. Her bag was the sort that had a wait list. None of that was what Maya noticed first. What Maya noticed first was the expression, the specific practiced tightening around the eyes that meant the conclusion had already been reached, and the evidence was just a formality. "Is this seat taken?" Evelyn asked, but she wasn't asking about the seat. She was asking something else entirely, and they both knew it. "This is my suite," Maya said, politely, evenly. Evelyn's eyes moved down to the sketchbook, to the tea, to Maya's hoodie, to her braids, and back up again in a movement so swift and dismissive it was almost elegant. "I see," she said in a tone that meant she saw plenty. She turned away without another word and moved toward the row across the aisle where her husband, Richard Reed, was already settling in jacket-folded reading glasses on phone in hand. Maya watched her go, then looked back at the sketchbook. The hands were still there waiting. She picked up her pencil. She should have known that wasn't the end of it. In her experience, it never was. Evelyn did not sit down quietly. That was not who Evelyn Reed was. Evelyn Reed had made a career, a life really, out of not sitting down quietly. She was on the board of 3 foundations, had chaired, 2 charity galas, had been photographed at the kind of events where photographs meant something, and was married to a man who was about to attend the J.P. Morgan Global Investment Summit as a keynote speaker. She was accustomed to people responding to her presence. She was accustomed to things being arranged. She leaned over to Richard and said something that Maya couldn't fully hear, but the shape of the sentence was clear enough. Richard looked over his glasses in Maya's direction, and whatever he saw made him look immediately back down at his phone and say something low and clipped that had the sound of a warning. Evelyn did not heed it. She pressed the call button above her suite. The flight attendant who appeared was a young woman named Sarah. Maya had noticed her name tag when she'd been offered the menu with a composed, professional face and the kind of posture that said she'd been trained for exactly this. "Mrs. Reed, can I help you?" Evelyn kept her voice at a normal conversational volume. She didn't try to be discreet. "Yes, I'd like to understand how the seating assignments in this cabin work." "Of course," Sarah said. "Every passenger in first class is assigned a suite based on their ticket. Is there a concern with your current—" "My concern," Evelyn said, "is with the assignment of this cabin in general." She gestured not at Maya, not directly, but in her direction, a gesture that managed to be both vague and completely unambiguous. "I'm not sure that the curation process for first-class passengers is being applied consistently." Sarah blinked, just once. "I'm not sure I follow, Mrs. Reed." "I think you do," Evelyn said pleasantly. Maya had stopped pretending to draw. She set her pencil down. She did not turn her head fully. She was watching from the edge of her periphery, the way you watch something when you want to see it clearly, without letting it know you're looking. Richard Reed said quietly, but with an edge now, "Evelyn, I'm simply asking a question, Richard." "You're not asking a question." "I am. I'm asking about standards." She looked at Sarah again. Ascend Air has a reputation. I'm a frequent flyer. I know what this cabin is supposed to feel like, and I'm telling you that something feels off. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Maya could see the slight stillness in her jaw, the micro-expression of someone choosing their words very carefully. "Every passenger in this cabin has met the same booking and boarding requirements, Mrs. Reed. There's no inconsistency I'm aware of." "Really?" Evelyn let the words sit there. Then, "Because I'm looking at this young woman over here, and I have to say she doesn't quite fit the profile of Mrs. Reed." Sarah's voice didn't rise, but something in it shifted, became a fraction more solid, like ground that had been soft a moment ago and was now rock. "I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. Are you suggesting that another passenger should be moved?" Evelyn smiled. It was a practiced smile. "I'm suggesting that perhaps a reaccommodation would benefit everyone." The word reaccommodation landed in the cabin like something thrown. Maya heard it and felt the specific exhausting heat of it, that word in that context wrapped in that smile, and she understood with total clarity what was happening and exactly what it meant. She'd been here before, not here, not on a plane, not in first class, but in the version of this that happened everywhere all the time to people who looked like her, who were her age, who walked into rooms where they were not expected and had to decide in the first 3 seconds how they were going to carry themselves through whatever came next. She'd been here in galleries where people assumed she was the cleaning staff. She'd been here in classrooms where teachers called on everyone else first. She'd been here at her own art shows twice when people asked to speak to the artist and then looked past her when she said she was. She knew the calculation. She knew the cost-benefit of saying something versus staying quiet. She knew that staying quiet felt like survival, and sometimes it was, and she knew that staying quiet felt like surrender, and sometimes it was that too. She picked up her pencil, not to draw, just to have something in her hand. Sarah was still speaking to Evelyn in measured professional tones. "I'm not able to reassign a seated passenger, Mrs. Reed. If you have a specific safety concern, I'm happy to." "It's not a safety concern," Evelyn said, and her voice had a new edge now, a frustration at having to explain what she apparently felt should have been self-evident. "It's an atmosphere concern. It's about what the cabin represents. This young woman," and now she did look at Maya directly without apology, "arrived with a backpack and a sketchbook. That's not a first-class passenger. That's someone who found a way to get a free ticket, and frankly, I find it embarrassing for the airline." The cabin was very quiet. Not silent. There was still the ambient hum of the ventilation system, the faint sound of someone further back shifting in a seat, but the kind of quiet that happens when every person in a room simultaneously stops pretending they're not listening. Richard said, "Evelyn, that's enough." Evelyn said, "I haven't said anything that isn't true." Maya stood up. She didn't plan to. One moment she was seated, and the next she was standing, and she wasn't sure if it was a decision or something more instinctive than that, the body making a choice the mind hadn't finished processing yet. She stepped out of her suite into the aisle, and she faced Evelyn Reed directly, and she said, "I'm sorry. Is there a problem?" Her voice was steady. It surprised her how steady it was. It didn't shake, it didn't rise. It was just there, present, like she was. Evelyn looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since she'd boarded. Whatever she'd expected, tears or anger or a stumbled apology or a kind of crumpling, wasn't what she got. "Yes," Evelyn said, "there is." "Okay," Maya said. "What is it?" "I've explained it already." "Explain it to me." Evelyn's chin lifted. "I find your presence in this cabin inappropriate." "Based on what?" A small pause. "Based on everything about this situation." "That's not an answer," Maya said. "I don't owe you an answer." "You're the one who started this conversation," Maya said. "I was sitting in my seat, drawing, drinking tea. I wasn't bothering anyone. So if you want to keep going, let's keep going, but I'd like to hear something specific." Richard Reed had taken his glasses off. He was watching his wife with an expression that was difficult to name, not quite horror, not quite resignation, but something hovering between them, the face of a man who had been here many times before and had never figured out how to make it stop. Another passenger, a man in his 60s, silver-haired, seated 2 suites back, had turned fully in his seat to watch. Sarah stood very still. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I find it presumptuous," she said finally, "that someone your age and your circumstances—" "What are my circumstances?" Maya asked. "Would be traveling in this section without some kind of—" "Without what?" Maya said. "Say it. Whatever you're trying to say it clearly, because I want to make sure we're all understanding each other." And there it was, the thing Evelyn hadn't expected. Not the question, not the calm, the refusal to make it easy, the refusal to give her the soft landing of implication of suggestion of genteel racism wrapped in the language of standards and atmosphere and profile. Maya was standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin, 19 years old, in a gray hoodie, and she was requiring Evelyn Reed to say out loud what she meant. Evelyn could not do it. She would not do it. Not directly. She'd spent too many decades learning to communicate this particular thing without ever having to say the words, because the words spoken plainly had a different texture. They became something you couldn't take back. I simply don't think, Evelyn said carefully, that you belong here. I have a ticket, Maya said. I have a seat assignment. I have been polite to every person on this plane. I have not bothered anyone. I have not been loud. I have not done a single thing that would give you any cause to say that. She stopped. Then, so the only reason you think I don't belong here is because of what you see when you look at me. Evelyn opened her mouth. Richard said, "Don't." And for once, his voice had real weight behind it. "Evelyn, don't." She closed her mouth. The silver-haired man in the back suite said quietly but distinctly, "She's right, you know." Evelyn turned. He met her gaze without blinking. "The young woman is entirely right." Evelyn looked around the cabin, then really looked maybe for the first time, and saw the expressions of the other passengers. Not aligned with her, not sympathetic. Uncomfortable, yes, but not in the way she'd expected them to be uncomfortable. They were uncomfortable with her. She sat down. Sarah exhaled very slightly and stepped toward Maya. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Maya said. And she was. She was shaking a little. Her hands. Just her hands, not visible unless you were looking for it. The body processing what the voice had refused to show, but she was fine. She went back to her suite. She sat down. She picked up her pencil. The hands in the sketchbook looked back at her. She had drawn something in the margin while she was listening to Evelyn, without realizing she was doing it a small, unconscious mark. A line that curved and came back to itself. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she started drawing around it, building something out of it, the way she always did with the marks she made when she wasn't thinking. The cabin settled. The boarding announcement came. The doors sealed. The engines began their low, growing roar, and the plane started to move. Evelyn Reed was still. She was looking out the window of her suite, with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression set in a way that suggested she was not finished. Not with this. Not with the morning. Not with the particular resentment that had taken hold of her in the moment she walked into this cabin and saw Maya Clark sitting there, young and calm and at ease, in a space Evelyn had decided before she'd crossed the threshold wasn't for her. Richard was watching his wife. He'd known her for 31 years. He'd watched this happen before, not exactly this, but versions of this, the accumulation of a lifetime of certainty that she was the authority on who belonged, where and what standards meant, and what atmosphere required. He had looked away from it many times. He had made peace with it many times in the cowardly way that people make peace with things they know are wrong, by telling themselves it's not their place to interfere. He was tired of it suddenly, with a completeness that surprised him. He was tired of it in a way that felt new. Maya was drawing. She drew the way other people breathed automatically continuously, as the primary means of making sense of what was in front of her. She was drawing Evelyn's hands, the way she'd been drawing the imagined hands when this began, and the resemblance was strange and sharp, and she let it be. The plane lifted. London was 9 hours away. And somewhere below them, before the clouds closed over Atlanta, stretched out in its familiar morning sprawl, the city she'd grown up in, the city she was leaving behind for 4 days to show the world something she'd made. She had not called her mother yet today. She'd meant to before boarding. She'd run out of time, or let herself run out of time, which wasn't quite the same thing. She would call when she landed, or maybe from the hotel. She turned a page in the sketchbook and started something new. Above her, the seatbelt sign chimed off. Around her, the cabin began its quiet adjustment into cruising altitude, and Evelyn Reed, 2 suites away, pressed the call button again. The call button chimed a second time, and Sarah turned toward Evelyn Reed's suite with the particular expression of someone who had already spent their goodwill and was now operating on professional obligation alone. She walked the 3 steps between the galley and the suite and said quietly, "Mrs. Reed, how can I help you?" Evelyn didn't look up immediately. She was adjusting the clasp on her Louis Vuitton bag, taking her time with it the way people do when they want you to understand that they are not in a hurry and that your time is less valuable than theirs. "I'd like to speak with the senior cabin manager," she said. "Not you, the manager." Sarah said, "I am the senior cabin manager on this flight, Mrs. Reed." Evelyn looked up then. She took Sarah in the name tag, the uniform, the posture, and something shifted in her face, a recalibration. "You're very young," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I want to file a formal complaint. I want it documented that I raised a concern about passenger placement in this cabin and that my concern was not addressed." "Your concern was addressed," Sarah said. "The passenger in Suite 3A holds a valid first-class ticket and is correctly seated according to her booking. There's nothing to document beyond that." "There is something to document," Evelyn said, her voice sharpening. "The way I was spoken to by that young woman, the way I was made to feel in front of other passengers, that is a cabin management issue." Sarah held very still. "Are you saying you'd like to file a complaint against another passenger?" "I'm saying I'd like someone to take me seriously." From across the aisle, Richard Reed said, without lifting his eyes from the newspaper he'd opened, "Evelyn, please stop." She turned to him. "Don't tell me to stop. I'm telling you to stop." "You always tell me to stop, Richard, and I always have, and where has that gotten us? I asked a reasonable question. I expressed a reasonable concern, and instead of being heard, I was lectured by a 19-year-old in a hoodie." Richard turned a page. "You weren't lectured. You were corrected." Evelyn's nostrils flared. "Excuse me." "She corrected you," he said, still not looking at her. "Because you were wrong. And you knew it, and everyone in this cabin knew it. And now you'd like someone official to make you feel better about it, which is not going to happen." The silence between them was not new. Maya could hear the shape of it from 2 suites away. That specific marital silence that has 30 years of architecture to it, walls and load-bearing beams, and a foundation that may or may not still be solid. She wasn't trying to listen. She simply couldn't not hear. The cabin was quiet enough that everything traveled. She kept her eyes on her sketchbook, but her pencil had slowed. Sarah said carefully, "Mrs. Reed, I can bring you a complaint form if you'd like to formally document your experience. I'm required to tell you that any complaint will be reviewed by Ascendair's passenger relations team and that all parties involved may be contacted." Evelyn said, "Fine, bring it." Sarah went to get the form, and in the moment she was gone, Evelyn turned and looked directly at Maya. Not with the evaluating squint from before, with something rawer than that, something that was almost the look of a person who knows they have gone too far but cannot locate the mechanism to reverse it. Maya met her eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't soften her expression into something more accommodating. She simply looked back the way she looked at subjects she was trying to understand openly, without judgment, but without apology either. Evelyn looked away first. The form arrived. Evelyn took it and held it in her lap for a long time without writing anything. Richard watched the clouds out the window. Maya turned a page. 40 minutes into the flight, a passenger named Gerald Whitmore introduced himself to Maya. He was the silver-haired man who had spoken up earlier, the one who'd said quietly but clearly that she was right. He leaned over from his suite, which was diagonal to hers, and said, "I hope you're doing all right. That was a difficult thing to sit through." "I'm okay," Maya said. "My name is Gerald." He offered his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm and unhurried. "I fly this route 4 times a year. I've never seen anything quite like that." "I have," Maya said, not bitterly, just as a fact. Gerald absorbed that quietly. "Are you traveling to London for work?" "My first solo gallery show? Mayfair." He blinked. A real blink of genuine surprise, not the performative kind. "Which gallery or Meridian House?" Something moved across Gerald's face. "Priya Menon's gallery. You know it?" "I'm on the board of the London Contemporary Art Foundation," he said. "We've partnered with Meridian House twice in the last 3 years. Priya is extraordinary." He paused. "What's your name?" "Maya Clark." He sat back very slightly, the way people do when a name lands with more weight than expected. "Maya Clark," he repeated. "I saw the advance press for your show, the feature in Art Forum last month." Maya stared at him. "You read Art Forum?" "My daughter is a sculptor. I've been reading it for 15 years. He smiled, and it reached all the way up. "You're extraordinary. Your work, particularly the series with the hands, it's extraordinary." Maya felt something move in her chest. Not pride exactly, something more complicated, more physical than pride. The kind of feeling that happens when the world unexpectedly confirms something you've been working toward in the dark for years alone, with no guarantee that anyone would ever see it. "Thank you," she said. "I should be thanking you," Gerald said. "Art like yours is rare. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone—" He stopped, and she understood he wasn't just talking about the art anymore. Don't let anyone make you feel like you've wandered into a room you don't belong in. You've been in this room your entire life. You just got here before some people were ready. 2 suites back, Evelyn Reed was listening. She was doing it poorly, pretending to look at the complaint form pen hovering, but she was listening. And something in Gerald's words hit a frequency that the shouting and the confrontation hadn't. Because Gerald Whitmore was old money, clearly. He had the voice of someone who had never once in his life felt the need to prove himself through volume or designer luggage. And when someone like that spoke with that kind of conviction about the girl Evelyn had just tried to have removed from the cabin, the math of the situation rearranged itself into something Evelyn didn't like. She set the complaint form on the side table. She didn't pick up the pen. Richard noticed. He said nothing. Sarah, passing through the cabin with drinks, also noticed. Her shoulders dropped by about a quarter inch. The meal service began an hour into the flight, and it was during the meal service that the second thing happened, the thing that changed the texture of the flight from tense to something more dangerous. Evelyn had ordered the sea bass. It arrived beautifully plated, and she barely looked at it. She'd been on her phone, a quiet, concentrated kind of phone, use the kind where the thumbs move fast and the expression doesn't change. Richard had eaten most of his meal and was now on his second glass of wine. He was watching her with the wariness of someone who knows a storm is building and can't do anything to stop it. "Stop looking at me like that," Evelyn said. "Like what?" "Like I'm about to do something." "Are you—" She set her phone face down. "I've been doing some research." "I wish you wouldn't." Maya Clark. She said the name as though trying it on. 19 years old, from Atlanta. She's had some social media attention, not viral, but growing. A few blog features, some community gallery shows. She paused. And her mother. She picked up her phone again and turned it toward Richard. Her mother. Richard looked at the screen. His expression did something complicated. "Isabella Clark," Evelyn said. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Richard said slowly. "Evelyn, does it—" "Don't do this." "Richard, does that name mean anything to you?" He set his fork down. "Yes, it means something to me." "Tell me what it means." "It means," he said with the deliberate quiet of someone choosing every syllable, "that you have made this significantly worse than it needed to be, and that I would like you to very seriously consider putting your phone down and finishing your sea bass and not doing whatever you're currently thinking about doing." Evelyn's eyes went back to the screen, then to Maya, then back to Richard. "She's the founder of this airline. I know who she is." Isabella Clark founded Ascend Air. This airline, the one we're sitting on. She let it hang there. Maya Clark, Isabella Clark. They have the same last name, Richard said. It's not a coincidence, Evelyn said. "Look at the photograph." He didn't look. "Richard, I don't need to look." "Why not?" "Because it doesn't matter." He said louder now, loud enough that Sarah, who was 1 suite away with a dessert cart, went very still. "Evelyn, it does not matter who her mother is. It did not matter before you found that photograph, and it does not matter now. You were wrong before you knew, and you're wrong now, and the only question is whether you're going to make it worse." Evelyn was quiet. She was looking at the photograph on her phone, and whatever was moving through her in that moment had the particular character of a person standing at the top of a staircase, deciding whether to stop or to lean forward. She leaned forward. She stood up. Maya was aware of movement to her left, the shift of air that happens when someone rises in a small space, and she looked up. Evelyn Reed was standing in the aisle again, and this time her face had something in it that hadn't been there before. Not contempt, not disdain. A calculation. "I know who you are," Evelyn said. Maya said nothing. Maya Clark. Evelyn held the phone slightly angled, not showing the screen, but making the reference clear. Isabella Clark's daughter. The cabin shifted. It was almost imperceptible, but Maya felt it, the collective intake of attention from the other passengers, the slight electrification of the air. "And," Maya said. Evelyn blinked. She had expected something else. Surprise, maybe, a flicker of exposure, the small flinch of someone whose cover has been pulled back. "And I find it interesting," she said, "that you sat through all of that without ever mentioning it." "Why would I mention it?" "Because it would have ended this." "I know," Maya said. "That's why I didn't." The silence that followed was the longest of the flight. Evelyn stared at her. Gerald Whitmore from across the aisle slowly set down his wine glass. Even Richard, who had been staring out the window as a form of survival, turned. "You didn't say anything," Evelyn said, "because you wanted to prove a point." "No," Maya said. "I didn't say anything because it shouldn't matter. I shouldn't have to tell you who my mother is for you to treat me like a human being. And I wasn't going to, not for you." She held Evelyn's gaze. "My ticket is valid because I earned this seat, not because of who she is, because of who I am. And I will not apologize for that." Evelyn stood there for a moment longer, then she sat back down. She did it slowly, and her hands were not quite steady when she reached for her water glass, and she drank from it facing away from the cabin. Richard exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for 45 minutes. Gerald Whitmore picked up his wine again and took a long sip and stared at the ceiling. Sarah came back with the dessert cart, and her professionalism was so intact, so perfectly composed, that Maya felt a sudden wave of respect for her, the amount of emotional labor that composure required, maintained invisibly professionally in the middle of all of this. "Would you like the chocolate fondant or the lemon tart?" Sarah asked Maya. "Fondant," Maya said. "Please." "Of course." Sarah plated it with the same precision she'd brought to everything else on this flight and set it on Maya's side table. Then she bent slightly, her voice low, meant only for Maya. "You handled that beautifully." Maya looked up at her. "Thank you." "I mean it." A pause. "And I'm sorry it happened. It's not your fault." "No," Sarah said, "but it happened on my watch, and I should have shut it down faster." She straightened. "I want you to know that everything that happened in this cabin today has been logged. All of it. That's not a threat to her. It's a promise to you." Maya nodded. She felt the weight of that not dramatically, not with tears or relief, but with the quiet, solid gratitude of someone who has been treated finally as the person they actually are. Sarah moved on to the next suite. The fondant was extraordinary. Maya ate it slowly, looking out the small window at the Atlantic far below. The water was the color of pewter. She thought about the hands in the sketchbook, about the way she'd drawn Evelyn's hands without meaning to, about what it meant that those two images, the ones she'd imagined and the ones she'd observed, had ended up looking so similar. She thought about her mother. She had not called her this morning. She had let herself run out of time, which was a habit she'd had since childhood, this tendency to delay the call, because the call meant something, and she wasn't sure yet how to explain what she felt. Her mother would ask how she was. She would say she was fine, and she would mean it, but the fine would contain everything that had happened in the last 2 hours, the way a small box sometimes holds a great deal more than its size suggests. She picked up her sketchbook. She turned to a blank page. She thought about what Gerald had said, that she'd been in this room her entire life, that she'd just arrived before some people were ready, and she thought about what it meant to make things by hand, to make something out of nothing but time and attention, and the stubborn belief that it mattered. She started drawing. She drew Evelyn Reed. Not from cruelty, not from satisfaction. She drew her from understanding the specific, uncomfortable understanding of someone who studies people for a living and can see even in the faces of those who have tried to diminish her something worth looking at. There was grief in Evelyn's face, Maya realized. Not the grief of someone who had lost something. The grief of someone who had spent a very long time being afraid and had learned to convert that fear into contempt because contempt felt stronger. She drew that. She drew Richard Reed, too, the look he'd had when he said she was wrong when the word had come out of him with that sudden real weight. The face of a man waking up late to something he already knew. And then she drew Gerald Whitmore, the silver-haired man who had spoken up and then bought her credibility in the currency that Evelyn Reed actually understood, not because Maya needed his credibility, but because it had been offered freely, without condition, and those kinds of gifts deserved to be recorded. She was deep in the drawing when she felt it a change in the cabin's atmosphere. Not dramatic, just a slight adjustment the way a room changes when someone new enters. She looked up. Sarah was walking toward the forward section of the cabin. She had her shoulders set in a particular way, and she was looking straight ahead, and there was something in her pace, not hurried but purposeful, that made Maya's pencil slow. Someone had sent Sarah a message, or called her forward, or both. Maya watched the curtain at the front of the cabin move, and then she heard a voice she knew, not from behind her, from ahead, from the direction of the curtain. Low, calm, authoritative in the way that real authority always is, not loud, not sharp, but deep, like something that doesn't need to prove itself. Maya felt her heart do something complicated. She looked back at her sketchbook, then back at the curtain. The voice came again, closer this time, in conversation with Sarah, and it had a quality that cut through the ambient noise of the cabin the way certain sounds do when they belong specifically to your nervous system and your history. Richard Reed across the aisle heard it too. He looked up. His eyes went to the curtain, then to Evelyn. Evelyn was looking at her phone. She had not looked up. She had not heard what Richard had heard, or if she had not yet understood what it meant. The curtain moved again, and the person who had been standing just beyond it stepped through. Maya closed her sketchbook. That was the first thing that registered. Not the recognition, not the shock, but the gap between the image Evelyn had found on her phone and the woman who was now standing 3 feet inside the first-class cabin. The photograph had been corporate, formal, a headshot from a board profile or a press release, the kind of image where everything is deliberate and controlled. The woman in the photograph had looked powerful in a contained, framed way, the power of someone who has been photographed enough to know exactly how to present it. The woman who stepped through that curtain was something else entirely. Isabella Clarke was in her mid-40s, and she moved like someone who had learned a long time ago that she didn't need to announce herself. She was wearing dark slacks and a simple white shirt, and she had her phone in one hand and a small leather notebook in the other, and she was speaking to Sarah in a low, focused voice, and she had not yet looked at Maya, and she had not yet looked at Evelyn, and somehow that was more commanding than if she had looked at either of them. Sarah was responding in short, efficient sentences, the way you respond to someone who asks precise questions and doesn't need the surrounding noise. Richard Reed watched this with the stillness of a man who understands fully and without ambiguity that the geography of a situation has just shifted in a way that cannot be undone. Evelyn looked up from her phone. She saw Isabella Clarke, and then she looked at Maya, and then back at Isabella. The resemblance was of the kind that doesn't announce itself immediately, not the obvious resemblance of identical features, but the subtler one, the one that lives in posture and in stillness, in the precise angle of the jaw, when the chin lifts slightly in the way the eyes don't apologize for looking directly at you. Maya had that. Isabella had it too. The same quality of presence that occupies space without crowding it. Evelyn set her phone face down on the side table. It was Maya noticed a completely unconscious gesture, the most honest thing Evelyn Reed had done since she boarded. Isabella finished her exchange with Sarah and then turned. She looked at the cabin with the particular thoroughness of someone reading a room rather than entering it. She took in Gerald Whitmore, who nodded once with the familiarity of someone who'd been in enough boardrooms to recognize an equal. She took in Richard Reed, whose expression had become very carefully neutral. She took in Evelyn Reed, who had arranged her face into something she probably believed was composed, and then she looked at Maya. And her whole expression changed, not dramatically, not with the obvious softening of a mother who is relieved. It was quieter than that. It was the specific change that happens in someone's face when they see a person they love, and they have been told enough in advance that something has happened to arrive already held together, already prepared to be steady. She walked down the aisle, past Evelyn's suite, past Richard's. She stopped at Maya's and looked at her daughter, and she said, "Scoot." Maya blinked. Then she moved her sketchbook and shifted toward the window, and Isabella sat down next to her and looked at her the way mothers look at children. They are checking for damage before they say anything about what they're actually feeling. "I'm fine," Maya said before her mother could ask. "I know," Isabella said. "You look fine. You look like you've been drawing for 3 hours and drinking cold tea and handling something that nobody should have had to handle alone." She glanced at the sketchbook. "Can I see?" Maya opened it. Isabella looked at the drawings without speaking. The imagined hands, the real ones, the portraits of Gerald and Richard and Evelyn that Maya had made without entirely meaning to. She looked at each one carefully, with the seriousness that Maya had always loved about her, the refusal to treat looking as a casual thing. "This one," Isabella said, touching the corner of the page with Evelyn's portrait, not the drawing itself, just the page. "This is her." Yes, you drew grief in her face. I know. Isabella looked at her daughter for a long moment. You're a better person than I am. You don't know what you would have drawn, Maya said. I know exactly what I would have drawn, Isabella said, and it wouldn't have had grief in it. Across the aisle, Evelyn Reed had gone very still. She had been still since Isabella sat down, but this was a different quality of stillness, not the controlled stillness of someone managing their presentation, but the rigid, braced stillness of someone who has realized they are sitting 2 feet away from a conversation they can hear and cannot escape. Richard had opened his newspaper again. It was a measure of how completely he had detached from the situation that he was reading the financial pages with what appeared to be genuine absorption. Gerald Whitmore was looking at Isabella Clark with an expression of quiet interest. He knew who she was, not in the way Evelyn had found out through a search and a photograph, but in the way you know someone when you've moved in the same circles long enough. He had met Isabella twice before, once at a foundation dinner in London, once at a conference in Dubai. He had thought then both times that she was someone who made rooms feel more honest just by being in them. He understood now where Maya had gotten that quality from. Isabella had turned slightly in the suite, and her voice dropped to the register that means the conversation is private, but not hidden. Tell me what happened. From the beginning, Maya told her. Not dramatically, not with the particular coloring that people put on stories when they want to make sure the other person understands the scale of the wrong. She told it plainly the way she'd told things to her mother since she was small, because Isabella had always responded better to plainness than to performance, and because Maya fundamentally was not a person who needed her pain to be amplified to be believed. She told her about boarding early, about the sketchbook, about the first exchange at the suite partition, the look the implied question. About Evelyn pressing the call button, about the word reaccommodation, about standing up in the aisle. She told her about saying, I'd like to hear something specific about Evelyn's face when she couldn't say it plainly, about sitting back down, about Gerald Whitmore saying she was right. Isabella listened without interrupting. This was one of the things Maya had counted on her mother's ability to listen completely, to absorb without reacting until she'd absorbed everything. It was a quality that made her extraordinary in a boardroom, and on the harder days made her a difficult person to be a daughter to, because it meant she rarely showed distress in real time, and distress in real time was sometimes what a daughter needed. But today, it was the right quality. When Maya finished, Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You didn't tell her? No. Even when she found out and came back? Especially then, Maya said. Isabella looked at her hands. Then she said quietly, with something in her voice that Maya recognized as the particular register her mother only reached when she was deeply moved and trying not to show it. When did you get so wise? I learned from someone, Maya said. Evelyn Reed made a sound. It was small, barely a sound at all, more like the absence of held breath, and it was involuntary, and both Maya and Isabella heard it. Isabella turned slowly and looked at Evelyn Reed for the first time since she'd sat down. The look was not cold. It was not furious. It was something much harder to bear than either of those things. It was the look of someone who is seeing you clearly and has decided to let you know it. Evelyn met it for about 4 seconds. Then she looked at the tray table. Isabella said, Mrs. Reed. Evelyn's head came up. I know who you are, Isabella said. I know your husband. I know the summit he's attending. I know the firm he represents. A pause, not for effect, but for precision. I also know what you did on this flight. Not from Sarah, though Sarah's log is thorough, but because 3 other passengers submitted written accounts before we were 2 hours into the flight. One of them unprompted. Gerald Whitmore looked briefly at the ceiling. Evelyn said, I was raising a concern. You were, Isabella said, trying to have my daughter removed from a first-class cabin because of the color of her skin and the fact that she is young and the fact that her clothing did not conform to your idea of who belongs in that section. Her voice had not risen. It didn't need to. I'm not going to debate that with you. The accounts are consistent, the log is complete, and the facts are not in question. Richard Reed put down his newspaper. What I want to say to you, Isabella continued, is something I want to say as a person, not as the owner of this airline, as a person. She let that land. I have flown many times in my life before Ascend Air existed, when I was Maya's age, when I was younger than Maya. I know what it feels like to walk into a space and have someone decide before you've said a word that you don't belong there. I know what it costs to sit still through it, and I know what it costs to stand up through it, and I know that both cost something, and neither cost should exist. She paused again. Maya paid that cost today. She paid it with grace and with intelligence and with more composure than most adults I know could have managed. And she paid it alone, which is the part I will carry the longest. Evelyn's hands folded in her lap tightened slightly. I am not asking you to apologize, Isabella said. An apology from you right now would not be for Maya. It would be for you to make yourself feel better, to close the loop, to perform a remorse that I'm not sure you've actually reached yet. I won't ask Maya to receive that. She stood. She straightened her shirt. But I am telling you that this flight and your behavior on it will have consequences. Not personal ones, I'm not interested in vengeance. Professional ones, procedural ones, the kind that an airline has both the right and the obligation to impose. She looked at Richard Reed, then directly. I'm sorry you were part of this. Richard said simply, So am I. Isabella looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and turned back to Maya's suite. She didn't sit back down. She stood at the partition and looked at her daughter with the expression of someone who has said the public thing and now needs a moment before they can say the private thing. Are you really okay? She asked. Her voice was different now, smaller, real. I am, Maya said. Mom, I'm okay. I got Sarah's message 40 minutes into the flight. I was in the office section. I didn't know you were on this flight. I know you didn't, Isabella said. I was going to surprise you in London. I'd planned to be at the gallery opening. A beat. I still am, but I got the message and I had to... She stopped, pressed her mouth together. I had to sit back there for a while and decide how to come in here. What do you mean? I mean, Isabella said, that my first instinct was not measured. And I know you. I know you would have hated it if I'd come in here like a storm. So I sat with Sarah's notes for 20 minutes, and I made myself think about what you actually needed, not what I wanted to do. Maya looked at her mother for a long moment. What did you want to do? Isabella smiled. It was brief and a little sharp and completely honest. Something that would have gotten me removed from my own airline, she said. Maya laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed since boarding, and it came out with more relief in it than she'd intended, and it filled the suite and spilled into the aisle, and Gerald Whitmore heard it, and something in his expression eased. Even Richard Reed across the aisle exhaled. Evelyn did not react. She was looking at the window. From this angle, Maya could see her profile, and she could see what she'd drawn in the sketchbook. The grief that had been there before she knew what to call it. It was still there. Maybe more of it now. Sarah appeared at the forward end of the cabin and gestured almost imperceptibly to Isabella. A signal. Something needed attention. Isabella straightened and looked at Maya. I have to deal with some things, she said. I know. I'll be back. Mom. Maya reached out and touched her arm just briefly, the quick press of reassurance that children give parents when they've realized somewhere along the way that the care runs in both directions. Thank you for waiting, for the 20 minutes. Isabella looked at her hand on her arm. Don't thank me for that, she said quietly. I should have flown down in 4 minutes. She covered Maya's hand with her own for just a second, then she let go, turned, and walked toward the forward galley. The cabin breathed. Gerald Whitmore reached for his wine and finished what remained in the glass. He looked at Maya and raised the empty glass, slightly a silent toast, and she lifted her teacup in return, even though it had been cold for an hour. Richard Reed reached across the aisle and pressed the call button. When Sarah appeared, he said, Can I get a scotch, please? Neat. He paused. And whatever the young woman in 3A is having, whatever she actually wants, put it on my account. Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then, Of course, Mr. Reed. Maya heard this exchange. She looked over at Richard. He was looking back at her, and he had the expression of someone who wants to say something and doesn't know if he's earned the right to say it yet, and she respected him for knowing the difference. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He didn't try to add anything to it. She looked back at her sketchbook. She hadn't turned to a new page. She was still on the one with Evelyn's portrait. She looked at it for a long time at the grief she'd put there before she'd understood it. She picked up her pencil and added something. Just a small thing in the corner of the page, a line that curved and came back. The same unconscious mark she'd made earlier, but deliberate now. Intentional. She didn't know yet what it meant. Sometimes things meant things only after time made them legible. She trusted that. It was how she'd always worked. Evelyn Reed had not moved in 12 minutes. She had not ordered anything. She had not called for Sarah. She had not spoken to Richard, who was sitting 3 feet away from her nursing his scotch. She was doing something that Evelyn Reed almost never did. She was thinking. Not planning, not calculating, not assessing and strategizing and deciding. Just thinking, the raw, uncomfortable kind that happens when the architecture you've built your certainties on has been struck in the right place, and you can hear for the first time that it's hollow in the middle. She was thinking about the word reaccommodation. How smooth it had felt in her mouth when she said it. How practiced. How many years she had spent learning to communicate this particular thing through words, like that clean, corporate, reasonable-sounding words that meant something else entirely, that everyone in the room understood to mean something else entirely, and that let her maintain in her own accounting the fiction that she had not said what she had said. She was thinking about Richard's face when he'd said you were corrected. She was thinking about the girl's face in the aisle, the steadiness of it, the refusal to give her the satisfaction of a flinch or a tear. She was thinking about the portrait she'd watched Maya draw, though she hadn't been meant to see it, the quick, sure lines of a sketchbook page visible for just a moment when Isabella had opened it, the image on the page unmistakably Evelyn's own face, and in it something she had not expected to find looking back at her. She was thinking about Isabella Clark's voice when she'd said, "I know what it costs." The scotch arrived for Richard. He took a sip. He looked at his wife with the careful attention of a man watching something shift, not knowing whether to trust the shift or wait for it to reverse. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. "Are you all right?" The question landed differently than she'd expected. Not challenging, not ironic, genuine. 31 years of marriage, and he still had the capacity to ask that question in a way that meant he actually wanted to know. "No," she said. He absorbed this. "Okay. I have been," she started and then stopped because the next word was a long one, a heavy one, the kind that once spoken cannot be unfiled. She said it anyway quietly, almost entirely to herself. Wrong. Richard very carefully did not react. He just waited. "Not just today," she said. He set down his glass. He turned toward her fully in the suite the way he hadn't turned toward her in a while, the full attention turn, the one that meant he was actually there. "I know," he said. "You've known," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "I did," he said. "You didn't want to hear it." She looked at her hands. The complaint form was still on the side table. She picked it up and looked at it. The blank lines, the check boxes, the spaces for incident description and desired outcome. She folded it, carefully in half and then in half again. And she put it in the outside pocket of the Louis Vuitton bag with the quiet deliberateness of someone putting something away for good. Richard watched her do this. Then from the forward section of the cabin, there was a sound not loud, but clear and purposeful. The distinct sound of a cabin phone being returned to its cradle, followed by the particular weight in the air that precedes an announcement. Sarah appeared at the front of the cabin. She was not carrying anything. She stood at the head of the aisle with her hands folded and her expression composed, and she looked first at Evelyn Reed, then at her husband, and then she said with the precise professional courtesy of someone delivering a decision that is not a negotiation, "Mr. and Mrs. Reed, I'd like to ask you to come with me, please." Evelyn Reed stood up slowly. She did it the way people stand when they are preserving in the last available moment whatever remains of their dignity deliberately, without hurry, without the sharp movements of someone caught off guard, as though rising on her own terms was still a form of control, even when it wasn't. She smoothed the front of her trench coat. She picked up her bag. She looked at Richard, who was already on his feet, and the look between them was not the look of a couple in crisis, but the look of two people who have arrived simultaneously at the understanding that something is over. Not their marriage, maybe, but something inside of it that had been weight-bearing for a long time. Richard gestured for her to go first. She did. They followed Sarah toward the forward section of the cabin, and as they moved down the aisle, Maya did not watch them go. She heard it, the soft displacement of air, the footsteps, the specific rhythm of two people walking in reluctant procession, but she kept her eyes on the sketchbook, and she kept her pencil moving, and she let them pass without ceremony, because the last thing she wanted was for this to become a performance of her winning. She had not wanted to win something. She had wanted to sit in her seat and draw hands. Gerald Whitmore, however, did watch. He turned slightly in his suite and tracked the reeds as they moved toward the curtain, and his expression held the particular measured satisfaction of someone who has lived long enough to know that justice, when it finally arrives, rarely looks the way you imagined it would, and is usually quieter. The curtain swung shut. The cabin was very still. Then from the suite nearest the galley, the woman who had been silent throughout the entire Flight 50s, reading glasses, dark blazer, who had not once looked up from her book during any of the preceding exchanges, set her book down on her knee and said clearly, and to no one in particular, "Good." It was one word. It landed in the cabin like a stone in still water, and the ripples from it moved through every person in the section, a small collective exhale, the cabin decompressing from 3 hours of tension it had been holding in its walls. Maya looked up. The woman in the dark blazer met her eyes, briefly, nodded once, and picked her book back up. Maya went back to drawing. The forward section of Ascend Air's A38. O had a private conference area just behind the cockpit, a small suite of 3 seats arranged around a fixed table, curtained off from the rest of business class, and used typically for operational meetings or private passenger situations that required a space between the luxury of first class and the visibility of the main cabin. Sarah had been trained for this room. She'd used it twice before in her career, once for a medical situation and once for a passenger who had become threatening. Both times the room had functioned as intended, a neutral space where a difficult conversation could happen without an audience. She led Evelyn and Richard there now, and when the curtain closed behind them and the ambient noise of the cabin fell away, the silence in the small space had a different quality. Contained, serious. Isabella Clarke was already in the room. She was seated at the table with her leather notebook open and her phone turned face down, and she looked up when they entered with the same composed stillness she'd brought into the first-class cabin, except in here, without the presence of the other passengers, it was more concentrated, more visible. The performance element was gone because performance required an audience, and this was not a performance. Richard sat down without being asked. Evelyn remained standing for 3 seconds, just long enough to establish that she was choosing to sit, not being made to, and then she sat. Sarah took the seat nearest the curtain. She opened her own tablet and pulled up the incident log she'd been building since the first call button. Isabella said, "I'd like to talk through what happened today. Not for my benefit, I understand what happened. For the record and for yours." Evelyn said, "I'd like to say something first." Isabella looked at her. "All right." A pause. In the confined space, every breath was audible. Evelyn's hands were on the table in front of her, and she was looking at them, and then she looked at Isabella and she said, "I was wrong." The words came out without the architecture of justification around them, which made them sound strange, almost raw, the way a word sounds when you say it in a language you're still learning. "I was wrong, and what I said, the way I behaved, it was wrong." Silence. Isabella said, "I heard you." "I'm not asking you to forgive it," Evelyn said. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I needed to say it without qualifications." Richard was looking at his wife with an expression that was hard to name. Not surprise exactly, something more like witnessing. "The reason I want to put it on the record," Isabella said carefully, "is not to punish you. I want to be very clear about that. This is not about punishment." She opened her notebook. "What happened in that cabin today is something that happens on commercial flights every single week in this country and around the world. A passenger of color, often young, often a woman, often doing nothing that any other passenger wasn't also doing, is made to feel that they don't belong in a premium cabin. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes, as it was today, it's explicit. It happens. And airlines, including mine, have historically managed these situations by prioritizing the comfort of the complaining passenger over the dignity of the person being targeted." She paused. "That ends. On Ascend Air, starting today, because of what my daughter went through today, and because I now have the authority to make that a policy and not just an intention." Richard said, "You're announcing a new policy." "I'm formalizing one," Isabella said. "The policy has existed in spirit. What it has lacked is teeth. Going forward, any passenger who harasses or attempts to displace another passenger based on race, age, gender, or appearance will be subject to immediate removal at the next available landing opportunity and permanent suspension of their account. No exceptions. No appeals based on frequent flyer status or corporate relationships." The word corporate fell with a specific gravity in that particular room between those particular people, and everyone in the room felt it. Richard said, "The summit." Isabella looked at him. "Richard is a keynote speaker," Evelyn said, and her voice was flat, not defensive. "At the J.P. Morgan Summit in London, tomorrow." "I know," Isabella said, "and Evelyn stopped. "I'm not doing anything to the summit," Isabella said. "That is not within the scope of what happened today, and I have no interest in conflating the professional with the personal beyond what this incident itself requires." She looked at Richard directly. "What happens at the summit is between you and J.P. Morgan. That's not mine to touch. What happens on this airline is—" Richard absorbed this. "What does that mean practically?" "It means—" Sarah said, her voice measured, reading from the tablet, that following a send air policy, as of this flight, both your accounts will be suspended pending a formal review. The review process takes 14 business days. If the review board upholds the complaint, and given the documentation we have, I can tell you that suspension of privileges is the likely outcome. You will not be permitted to fly a send air for a period to be determined by the board. Minimum is 1 year. Evelyn said, "We fly this airline 40 times a year." "I know," Isabella said. "Between the two of us, I know your account history, Mrs. Reed. I know it in detail." She let that sit. "That history does not change what happened today. It does not change what I watched happen to my daughter. Frequency of travel is not immunity." Evelyn was quiet. She was looking at her hands again. "Will this be made public?" Isabella's expression shifted very slightly. "What specifically are you asking?" "I'm asking whether this will be reported, whether there will be press." "We don't issue press releases about passenger incidents," Isabella said. "That's our policy. Passenger information is private." The smallest measure of relief moved through Evelyn's posture. "However," Isabella said, and the word was quiet and entirely without drama, and it was the most consequential word spoken in that room, 3 passengers submitted voluntary written accounts of the incident. Those accounts belong to them. What they choose to do with them is not within my control." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. "Gerald Whitmore submitted one of them," Isabella said. "I think you know who Gerald is." Evelyn said nothing. "He's been on the board of the London Contemporary Art Foundation for 11 years. He is also a regular contributor to 3 major publications. Arts, Culture, Travel. I don't know what he intends to do with his account. I genuinely don't. But I think you should know it exists." Richard opened his eyes. He was looking at a point on the wall somewhere between Isabella and the curtain. He had the expression of someone mentally running calculations that had stopped adding up. Evelyn said, "Is there anything we can do?" Isabella looked at her steadily. "To change the airline's decision, no. She stopped. "Is there anything we can do that would be appropriate?" She was stumbling through the sentence, and for once she wasn't smoothing it out, wasn't reaching for the polished language. She was leaving the rough edges visible. "For Maya." Isabella was silent for a moment. Sarah had stopped typing. "That's between you and her," Isabella said. "I'm not going to broker that. I'm not going to tell you what to do or whether to do it. What I will tell you is that my daughter is the most independently minded person I know, and if you say something to her, say it because you mean it, and not because you're hoping it changes anything. She'll know the difference." Evelyn nodded. "Once." "Is there anything else you need from this meeting?" Isabella asked. Richard said no. "Then I'd ask you to return to your suites. You'll be served for the remainder of the flight as normal. The crew will treat you with the same professionalism they've shown throughout." She paused. "That's the standard on this airline. It applies to everyone." They filed out. The curtain swung closed. Sarah stayed a moment, made a final note in the log, and then looked at Isabella. Are you all right? Sarah asked. Isabella looked up. Which part of that are you asking about? The part where you had to sit still and use policy language when you probably wanted to. Yes, Isabella said. I'm all right. A pause. Get me a coffee, would you? Strong. Sarah almost smiled. Of course. Maya was improbably asleep. Not fully the half-sleep of a long flight pencil still loose in her hand, sketchbook open across her knees, head tilted slightly against the suite partition. The tension had left her body in the way tension does when the thing you've been bracing against finally resolves not with triumph, but with the simple cessation of the need to hold yourself so carefully in place. Gerald Whitmore noticed. He glanced over, saw her settled, and adjusted his own position so that the light from his reading lamp angled away from her. The Reeds returned to their suites quietly. Evelyn sat down and looked at her hands for a long time. Richard poured himself a glass of water and did not touch the scotch. They sat in the particular silence of two people who have said everything important and have not yet figured out what comes next, and for now have agreed wordlessly that next can wait. It was Richard who moved first. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small card, a business card, white simple with his name and a number on it. He held it in his hand and looked at it. Then he looked at Maya sleeping 2 suites away. He put the card back in his pocket. He would decide later. The flight crossed into British airspace 3 hours after the forward section meeting, and the light changed in the way it does over the Atlantic, the particular quality of northern European afternoon, pressing through the small windows, gray-white and clean. Maya woke up to it. She sat up, oriented herself, looked at the sketchbook. The pencil had rolled against her knee. She set it in the spine of the book and closed it. She could feel the shift in the cabin, the adjustment of pressure, the faint change in engine sound that means altitude is dropping, and somewhere below the clouds a runway is getting ready. She reached up and pressed the call button. Sarah appeared almost immediately. Good morning, or afternoon, I suppose. I lost track, Maya said. Could I get some water? Of course, and your mother asked me to let you know she'd like to see you before we begin descent if you're up for it. Tell her yes. Sarah went for the water. Maya looked out the window. The clouds were thick below them, and London was somewhere in there invisible waiting. 4 days until the show, 22 pieces, 2 years of work. The thought had been sitting in the back of everything all-day patient, and now it came forward not with anxiety, but with the warm, solid weight of something real. She was still looking at the clouds when she heard movement in the aisle and looked over to find Evelyn Reed standing at the partition of her suite, not with the commanding posture she'd had when this all began, not with the chin lifted and the expression of someone who has decided something, standing with her hands at her sides, which was the most vulnerable posture Evelyn Reed had probably maintained in decades, because people who have learned to wield their hands in gestures, in pointed accusations, in the precise weight of a designer bag on the crook of an elbow, reveal something essential about themselves in the moments when they let them just hang. I'd like to speak to you, Evelyn said, if you're willing. Maya looked at her for a moment. All right, Evelyn took a breath. What I did today was wrong. She said it the way she'd said it to Isabella without the scaffold of justification. I looked at you when I got on this plane, and I decided before you'd said a single word that you didn't belong here, and that decision had nothing to do with you. It had to do with me. With assumptions I've carried for a very long time and never examined because examining them would have required me to look at myself in a way I'd been avoiding. Maya was listening. She didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to accept this, Evelyn said. I know what I did. I tried to have you removed from your seat. I used words designed to be polite enough to hide what I meant, and everyone in that cabin understood what I meant, including you. And the fact that I never said the actual word doesn't mean I wasn't saying it. She paused. It just means I was a coward. The last word surprised Maya. She hadn't expected coward. It was the most precise thing Evelyn had said all day. I don't want anything from you in return, Evelyn said. I don't want forgiveness. I'm not going to ask you to shake my hand or tell me it's fine because it's not fine, and I know it's not fine, and pretending otherwise would be another form of cowardice. She exhaled. I just wanted you to hear that I understand what I did. I understand it now in a way I didn't when I was doing it, which is something I'm going to have to live with. And I wanted you to hear me say it. The cabin was quiet. Gerald Whitmore was absolutely still. Maya held Evelyn's gaze for a long moment. "I heard you," she said. Evelyn nodded. "That word you used," Maya said. "Coward. That's the right word." She wasn't unkind when she said it. She wasn't sharp. She said it the way she'd drawn Evelyn's portrait, with understanding, not cruelty. "I think you've probably known it for a while." Evelyn's expression moved. It was brief and private and real. "Yes," she said. "I think so." "Then that's the place to start," Maya said. "Not with me. With that." Evelyn stood for another moment. Then she turned and went back to her suite, and she sat down, and she looked out the window, and Richard reached over and put his hand on hers without saying anything, and she let him. Isabella appeared from the forward section. She looked at Maya, then at the reeds, and she read the room with the speed of someone who has spent a career doing exactly that. She came to Maya's suite and sat down again, and this time her posture was different, looser, more present. The held-together quality of the earlier visit replaced by something more like her ordinary self. "She came and spoke to you," Isabella said. "Yes. I didn't ask her to." "I know," Maya said. "I could tell." Isabella looked at her daughter. "How are you really? Not the fine version." Maya thought about it honestly, which was always what her mother required. "I'm tired," she said. "And I'm okay. Both of those things are true at the same time." "That's a very grown-up answer." "I've had a very grown-up day." Isabella's expression softened. She reached out and touched Maya's braids once briefly, the way she'd done since Maya was small, a gesture that meant something between, "I see you and you're mine, and I'm sorry for every time the world was harder than it should have been." "Tell me something about the show," Isabella said. "Tell me about one piece. Which one are you most nervous about?" Maya thought. "The last one. Number 22. It's the largest. 6 feet by 4. It's the one I made in the last 3 months, when everything finally made sense. When I finally understood what the whole series was about." "And what is it about?" "Hands," Maya said. "It's all hands, but not the way I thought it was going to be when I started. I thought it was going to be about holding things, about what people carry. But by the end, I understood it was about letting go." She looked at her sketchbook. "About the moment right before you release something. What that looks like in the body, in the hands specifically." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "Did you know," she said, "that I've never seen that piece?" "I know. You sent me photographs of everything except that one." "I know," Maya said again. "Why?" Maya looked at her. "Because I wanted you to see it for the first time in the gallery, with the right light, with all the other pieces around it." She paused. The photograph wouldn't have been enough. Isabella Clarke, founder of Ascend Airwoman, who ran a company of 4,000 people who had walked into a first-class cabin 4 hours ago and delivered a measured and devastating address to the woman who'd tried to have her daughter removed, sat back in the suite seat and pressed her lips together for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was very slightly unsteady. 4 days, she said. 4 days, Maya agreed. Below them, through the clouds, the lights of London were beginning to come through. The city materializing out of the gray patient as it always was, enormous and ancient and full of galleries and galleries and galleries, and in one of them, in 4 days, 22 pieces of work that had been made in the hours before dawn and the hours after midnight, and every ordinary hour in between work that had been made through every doubt and every guidance counselor who said she had no future, and every stranger who said she was promising, and every version of today that had come before this one. The seatbelt sign chimed on. The descent had begun. Maya opened her sketchbook to a new page. She looked at it, the white of it, the unformed possibility of it. She picked up her pencil. She started drawing London before she could even see it. She drew it from memory and from imagination and from the specific hope of someone who had survived the day they'd had and was still here, still moving forward, still adding lines to a page that had nothing on it yet. Sarah came through the cabin for the pre-landing check. She stopped at Maya's suite, looked at what she was drawing, and said simply, "I'd buy that." Maya smiled. And somewhere in the forward section, beyond the curtains and the conference room, and the space between what had happened and what came next, the engines adjusted their pitch, and the great plane began its long, slow fall toward the runway, and everything that had been suspended in the air for 9 hours prepared finally to land. The wheels touched down at Heathrow at 4:17 in the afternoon London time, and the cabin filled with the particular sound of collective relief that always accompanies a landing. The deceleration, the drag, the world rushing back up to meet you after hours of suspension. Maya kept her pencil moving until the very last moment, finishing the line she was on before she closed the sketchbook and slid it into her carry-on. She had drawn 12 pages on this flight. She hadn't planned to draw at all. That was how her best work always came, not from intention, but from necessity, from the body finding its way through something the mind hadn't finished processing. Isabella was already standing when the seatbelt sign chimed off. She was at the forward section of the cabin speaking quietly with Sarah, and she had her phone in her hand again, and her operational face back on the face of someone who runs a company and cannot even at 35,000 feet, having just had the most difficult afternoon of her recent memory, turn that off completely. Maya had made peace with that face a long time ago. It was the same face that had built the airline she'd just flown on, the same face that had raised her alone after her father left when she was 7. The same face that had listened to Priya Menon's pitch for Maya's gallery show and then written a check without hesitation, not because she was her mother, but because she had looked at the 22 pieces of work and understood with the clear, cold certainty of someone who recognizes real things that it was worth it. The Reeds were gathering their belongings in silence. Richard had his jacket on and his briefcase organized. Evelyn was moving slowly, the deliberateness of earlier in the flight replaced by something heavier, not grief, exactly, not shame, exactly, but the particular fatigue of a person who has spent a day being forced to look at themselves and has not yet decided what to do with what they saw. Gerald Whitmore stood in the aisle and waited for Maya to gather her things. When she emerged from the suite with her carry-on over one shoulder and her sketchbook tucked under her arm, he was there and he said, "I meant what I said earlier about your work." "I know," Maya said. "Thank you." "I'll be at the opening." He said it simply. "I was planning to be anyway before all of this. But I wanted you to know that what happened today, it won't go unremarked. Not by me." Maya looked at him. "What do you mean?" He reached into his coat and produced a card. "I write a column, Culture and Society primarily. I've been doing it for 20 years. He paused. "I won't use your name without your permission, but what happened in this cabin is it's a story about more than one woman and one flight. It's a story about who we decide belongs in certain rooms, and it deserves to be told." Maya took the card. She held it and looked at it and thought about what it meant not for her, but for the next person who got on an airplane with a sketchbook and a ticket they'd earned and sat in a seat that someone else had already decided wasn't for them. "You can use my name," she said. Gerald looked at her. "Are you sure?" "If you're going to tell it," she said, "tell it whole. Tell it with my name. I'm not ashamed of what happened today. I didn't do anything wrong." He held her gaze. Then he said with a gravity that had nothing performative in it, "No, you didn't." They moved toward the exit. The cabin was filing out in the quiet, organized way of a flight that has been long and is now finally done. Sarah stood at the door and said goodbye to each passenger with the professional warmth she'd maintained through everything, and when Maya reached her, she stopped, and they looked at each other for a moment. "Safe travels," Sarah said. "Thank you," Maya said, "for everything you did today. I should have done it faster." "You were doing your job," Maya said. "You did it well." Sarah nodded. "Go show them what you made." Maya stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, and the air was different, instantly cooler, carrying the particular metallic cleanness of a large airport. The smell of distance traveled and distance yet to go. Isabella fell into step beside her phone, finally put away, and for a moment they walked without speaking, which was one of the things Maya had always loved about being with her mother, the fact that silence between them was never uncomfortable, never required filling. It was Isabella who spoke first. "The gallery sent a car." "I know. Priya texted me. She wants to do a walkthrough of the installation tomorrow morning." A pause. "If you're up for it." "I'll be up for it." They came through the arrivals corridor and the light changed, and the world opened up around them in the way airport arrivals halls do, all that concentrated movement and reunion and the particular human intensity of people finding each other after time apart. What Maya didn't know, because she had been on a plane all day and her phone had been in airplane mode since Atlanta, was that the world outside the cabin had not been standing still while the world inside it was moving. Gerald Whitmore had not waited until they landed. He had filed his column from the air. He had a standing arrangement with his editor, a woman named Claire Ashworth, who had been running the culture section of one of London's most widely read publications for 16 years, that allowed him to submit from anywhere, anytime, whenever something required immediate attention. He had used this arrangement 17 times in 20 years. The piece had gone live at 2 p.m. London time, while the plane was still over the Irish Sea. By the time Maya stepped off the jet bridge, it had been read 40,000 times. By the time she cleared customs, it was trending. She didn't know any of this. She knew something had happened the moment she turned her phone off airplane mode, and it began to vibrate continuously in her hand. Not the ordinary series of accumulated notifications, but the sustained, unrelenting pulse of something that has gone beyond ordinary. She stopped walking. Isabella stopped beside her. "What's happening?" Isabella asked. Maya stared at her screen. There are so many." She opened the first notification, and then the second, and then the third, and the picture assembled itself quickly the way pictures do when they're made of many consistent pieces. Gerald's column. The title, "Who Belongs in First Class?" Her name. The story told with accuracy and precision and the particular moral clarity of someone who had been in the room and had watched it from beginning to end. "Gerald published something," Maya said. Isabella took the phone. She read in silence. Her expression did not change dramatically, but her jaw set in the way it did when she was absorbing something important and deciding what to do with it. She scrolled further. She handed the phone back. "He didn't ask your permission before filing," she said. "He asked me on the plane if he could use my name," Maya said. "I told him yes." Isabella looked at her. "You knew he was a journalist." "He said he wrote a column." Maya. "I meant what I said to him," Maya said. "If it gets told, it should be told whole. With my name. I don't want to be a story where the person it happened to is anonymous. That's not the story I want told." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, looking at her daughter with the specific expression she got when she was evaluating something, and the evaluation was coming out in a direction she hadn't predicted. "All right," she said. "All right. Is there a problem with it being public?" "Not from my end. The policy announcement I made on the plane, I was going to release a formal version of it through Ascend Air's communications team tomorrow. This accelerates that." She paused. "I may need to get ahead of it tonight." "I know," Maya said. "Do what you need to do. The opening is in 4 days. Mom, do what you need to do." Isabella took her phone out and called someone. She stepped aside, and Maya stood in the arrivals hall with her carry-on and her sketchbook, and her phone still vibrating in her hand, and she read Gerald's piece from beginning to end. He had written it beautifully. Not sensationally, not with the particular heat of a story designed to generate outrage for its own sake. He had written it the way the best writing does, with precision, with humanity, with a clear eye on what actually mattered. He had described what he saw without embellishment. He had quoted nothing directly reconstructed, nothing he had given the emotional architecture of what had happened, and let the reader feel it without being told how. He had described Maya not as a victim, and not as a hero, but as a person, a 19-year-old artist who had boarded a plane with a sketchbook and a valid first-class ticket, and had been required by someone who had decided, before she'd spoken a word, that she didn't belong to defend the simple fact of her own presence. He had ended with a question, not rhetorical. An actual question. When we talk about who belongs in a room, are we talking about what someone has earned, or are we talking about what they look like? And if we're honest with ourselves, what has that decision cost us? Not in politics, not in policy, but in the specific human loss of everything we didn't get to see. Everything. We didn't get to experience every piece of art that never got made or never got seen because someone looked at the artist and decided before she'd drawn a single line that she wasn't the kind of person who should be given the space to create. Maya stood there in the arrivals hall and read it. And when she finished, she stood still for a moment with the phone at her side, and she thought about the hands she'd been drawing when this all began. The imagined hands, old and veined, holding something that might have been a letter, or might have been a leaf. She thought about what it meant to let go. She thought about painting 22, the large one, the one she hadn't photographed for her mother, because it needed to be seen in the right light, with the right company. She was ready for London. The car was waiting outside arrivals, and it took them to a hotel in Mayfair that Priya Menon had chosen with the specific taste of someone who understood that the experience surrounding art matters as much as the art itself. The hotel was quiet and elegant and old, and the room they put Maya in had high ceilings and a window that looked out onto a street that had been a street for 300 years. She put her carry-on on the bed and opened it, and she took out her sketchbook and she set it on the desk. She showered and changed. She ordered soup from room service because she hadn't eaten since the fondant on the plane and hadn't fully realized it until now. And then she sat at the desk with the sketchbook open and the soup in front of her. And she looked at everything she'd drawn on the flight. The imagined hands, Evelyn's real ones, Gerald's face, Richard's face, that moment when his voice had real weight behind it, the hasty lines of the London she'd drawn before she could see it. She turned through the pages slowly, the way you read back through a day that was too full to take in while it was happening. Her phone had not stopped. Notifications, messages, names she recognized, and names she didn't. A text from Priya, I see the piece. Call me when you're settled. I'm not worried, I'm thrilled. Another from a friend in Atlanta, Maya. Maya, are you seeing this? And then from an unknown number, a message that she opened with the faint caution of someone who knows that attention when it arrives in large quantities is not uniformly kind, a message that turned out to be from Claire Ashworth, Gerald's editor, asking if Maya would be willing to be photographed for the publication. Not a profile, she clarified, not an interview if Maya didn't want it, just a portrait. Gerald's piece is one of the finest things he's ever written, she said, and I'd like the face that belongs with it. Maya set the phone down and looked at the sketchbook. She thought about what it meant that 20,000 now, 40,000 now, however many people were reading about what had happened in that cabin today. She thought about the woman who would board a plane next week with a look on her face that said she was deciding whether the person 2 suites away belonged there. She thought about whether that woman would pause even briefly, and whether that pause would mean anything, and whether a pause was enough. And she thought about the honest answer, which was that a pause was not enough, but a pause was a beginning, and beginnings were what she'd always worked with. The soup was good. She ate all of it. She called Priya. Priya answered on the first ring, which was characteristic of her. Tell me everything, she said. Maya told her. The whole thing in the plain, unembellished way she'd told her mother, because Priya deserved the plain version too. Priya listened without interrupting, not the way Isabella listened, with the internal stillness of someone holding everything, but with small sounds, the occasional sharp intake of breath, the quiet no that came out of her when Maya described the word reaccommodation, the longer silence when Maya told her about standing up in the aisle. And you drew her, Priya said when Maya had finished. In the sketchbook. You drew the woman who tried to have you removed. Yes. A pause. Can I see it? At the walkthrough tomorrow, Maya said. I'll bring the book. Maya. Priya's voice had changed register. What you did on that plane today, not the confrontation, although that too, but the drawing. The fact that your response to that experience was to pick up your pencil and try to understand what you were seeing rather than to simply react to it. She stopped. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. That is what makes you extraordinary. I didn't feel extraordinary, Maya said. I felt tired. The two are not mutually exclusive, Priya said. In my experience, they're usually the same thing. The next morning, the story had been read 200,000 times. Ascend Air's communications team had released a formal statement overnight, a real statement, not the careful corporate language of damage control, but a direct policy-level commitment. Zero tolerance for racially motivated displacement of passengers, mandatory crew training, a formal review board for cabin discrimination complaints. and the announcement that the airline was establishing the Elevation Standard, a named policy initiative that would be rolled out across all Ascend air routes within 90 days. The name had been Isabella's. Maya found out at breakfast when her mother appeared at her hotel room door with 2 coffees and the slightly compressed expression of someone who has been on the phone since 5 a.m. "The Elevation Standard," Maya said. "It was on every boarding pass already," Isabella said. "It seemed right." "It is right." "The communications team wanted to call it the Clark Initiative." I said no. "Good. It shouldn't be named after us," Isabella said. "It should be named after what it's supposed to do." Maya wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Is it going to actually do it?" "If I enforce it, yes." A pause. "And I will enforce it, personally. The review board reports directly to me." "What about the Reeds?" Isabella sat down on the edge of the chair by the window. "Their accounts have been suspended. The review board will meet next week. Based on the documentation, the outcome is a permanent ban." She paused. "Richard Reed contacted me this morning." Maya looked at her. "What did he say?" "He asked whether there was anything he could do practically financially to support the new policy. He offered a personal contribution to whatever training fund we set up." She held her coffee with both hands. "I told him I'd consider it and let him know." "Are you going to—" "The money would be useful," Isabella said carefully. "And if he gives it, it won't be for us, it'll be for the training, the crew development." She looked at her daughter. "But I wanted to tell you before I decided." Maya thought about it. About Richard's face in the aisle when he'd said, "Don't." About the scotch he'd ordered for her without being asked. About the way he'd said "so am I," without flinching, when Isabella told him she was sorry he'd been part of it. "Tell him yes," she said. "On one condition." "What?" "He comes to the gallery opening." Isabella stared at her. "He told you he's sorry," Maya said. "He demonstrated it at least partially. Let him see what he was on a plane with. Let him see what I do. That's worth more than a check, and the check is worth more with that attached to it." She paused. "I'm not inviting Evelyn, but him. Yes." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You are a better person than I am. You said that yesterday. I'm saying it again. It remains true." The gallery walkthrough that morning was the first time Maya had seen the 22 pieces installed in the same space in sequence with Priya's lighting and Priya's hanging, and the specific intelligence of someone who had spent 20 years thinking about how art lives in rooms. Priya met them at the door, tall, focused a woman who wore her authority lightly because she'd never needed to perform it, and led them through in silence, which was the correct way to walk through a gallery the first time. Maya walked beside her mother. She looked at the pieces one by one, and it was like meeting people she knew in a new context, recognizing them, but seeing them differently the way you see yourself in a photograph that captures something you'd forgotten was there. The early pieces, the ones from when she was 16 and 17, smaller, more tentative, the graphite heavier in some places than it needed to be, the uncertainty of someone who is still deciding whether she's allowed to take up space. The middle pieces from the year she turned 18, more confident, the line surer, the negative space beginning to function as part of the image rather than what was left over. And then the last ones, the ones from this year. They stopped in front of painting 22. It was 6 feet by 4. It took up the end wall of the gallery's final room, which Priya had given over to it entirely, with nothing else on the walls and a single warm overhead light that made the surface glow in a way that photographs simply could not. The painting was of 2 hands, enormous, rendered in charcoal and graphite, and the faintest wash of warm amber that Maya had added in the final week before she'd called it done. The hands were open. They were not holding anything. They were in the moment, just after release, fingers, slightly curved palms, upward the joints and tendons, carrying the memory of what had been there and wasn't anymore. Isabella stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Maya stood beside her and waited. "This is what you've been working toward," Isabella said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes. The whole series. All 22. This is where it ends up." "Yes." "Letting go." Isabella's voice was quiet. "Why hands?" "Because hands are how we hold things," Maya said, "and how we build things. and how we hurt people sometimes, and how we reach out." She paused. "And because I've been drawing hands since I was 12 and I never fully understood why until I made this one." "Why?" Isabella asked. "Because I was always trying to understand what it meant to hold on and what it meant to let go," Maya said. "Every drawing I've ever made of hands was really asking that question. What do we hold? What do we carry? And at what point does carrying something stop being strength and start being weight?" Isabella turned and looked at her daughter, and her face did something that Maya had only seen twice in her life, the face of someone who is not going to hold it together, has decided not to try, is going to let the feeling through completely and without management. Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Not today specifically, not for what happened on the plane, for all of it, for the 12-year-old who started drawing hands and the 19-year-old who figured out what she was drawing." Maya felt her own throat tighten. "Don't cry. I'll cry." "I'm not crying," Isabella said, which was obviously not true. "Mom." "I'm not." She exhaled. "I'm also crying." Priya, who had given them space at the far end of the room and was now studying a painting she had already studied extensively, glanced over at them, and then glanced away with the graceful discretion of someone who understands the difference between witnessing and intruding. 3 days later, the gallery opened. Gerald Whitmore came. He arrived early before the crowd and walked through the series slowly and alone, which was the kind of attention that felt like a gift. When he reached painting 22, he stood in front of it for a long time, and then he came back to find Maya and said, "I'll be writing about this separately. The flight piece was one story. This is a different one. This is about what you make." "Will you ask before you publish this time?" Maya said. He looked slightly abashed. "I should have asked before the first one." "Yes," she agreed, "but I meant what I told you. I don't regret it." "Neither do I," he said. "It's been read 600,000 times." Richard Reed came. He came alone without Evelyn, with the quiet, slightly uncertain posture of a man who was not sure he had the right to be there, but had decided that not coming would be the greater wrong. He walked through the whole gallery. He stood in front of painting 22 for longer than anyone except Gerald. When he found Maya afterward, he shook her hand. He didn't make a speech. He said, "Thank you for letting me come." And she said, "Thank you for being here." And that was the entirety of it, and it was enough. The crowd arrived at 7, and the room filled with the warmth of people who love art and the particular electricity of a first opening, when the work is new to the world and the world is still deciding what it thinks. Priya worked the room with her usual contained brilliance. Isabella stood beside her daughter for the first hour and then went to talk to people she needed to talk to, because she was always in every room the person who needed to talk to people. And Maya loved her for it and had made peace with it a long time ago. Maya moved through this gallery and answered questions and received the particular vulnerability of strangers telling her what her work did to them, which was the thing about showing art publicly that she had never fully prepared for. Not the praise, but the intimacy of it, the way people offered themselves when they'd been moved by something the trust that required. A woman in her 70s stopped her in front of painting 14. She had been standing in front of it for several minutes before Maya reached her. She was holding her own hands loosely in front of her, and she was looking at the painting the way people look at things that have reached them somewhere specific. "My daughter gave me your name," she said. "She read about what happened on the flight, and she said I needed to come." She paused. "I lost my husband last year. We were married for 48 years. Maya waited. "These hands," the woman said. "The series, all of it, but especially this one." She gestured at painting 14, which showed hands that were still holding the shape of something they'd been gripping. The fingers slightly curved inward, the palms mapping the ghost of an absence. "I've been trying to understand what it feels like. Not the grief. I understand the grief, but the what your hands do when there's nothing left to hold. The muscle memory of it." She looked at Maya. "You drew exactly that. How did you know?" Maya looked at painting 14. She had made it in November alone in the early hours of a morning when she couldn't sleep, not from any specific grief, but from the accumulated understanding of someone who pays close attention to people and draws what they see, and sometimes reaches further than they know. "I didn't know," she said honestly. I was just trying to see it clearly." The woman nodded. She put her hand briefly on Maya's arm. Then she went back to looking at the painting. The night ran long and the crowd thinned, and eventually it was just the gallery and the light and the 22 pieces on the walls and Priya and Isabella and Maya and 2 staff members quietly collecting glasses. Priya poured 3 measures of wine and handed them around and said, "Well, well," Isabella agreed. Maya looked at painting 22 from across the room, the open hands the moment after release, the enormous quiet of it. She thought about everything the day on the plane had cost her, and everything it had given her, which were not equal things and were not meant to be equal. And she thought about what Gerald had written and what Isabella had formalized, and what Richard had done by showing up, and what Evelyn had done by folding the complaint form and putting it in her bag, and what the woman with 48 years of marriage had said about muscle memory and the shape of absence. She thought about the guidance counselor who'd told her at 15 that she had no future in art. She thought about the stranger at the coffee shop who'd called her promising. She thought about Priya, who had looked at her work when she was 18 and said, "You are extraordinary." She thought about sitting in Suite 3A with a pencil in her hand and a cup of green tea going cold, and someone pointing at her and saying that word belongs, as though belonging was something they had the authority to assign. She thought about standing up. She picked up her wine glass. "To the elevation standard," she said. Isabella raised hers. "To the elevation standard." Priya raised hers. "To the artist." Maya looked at painting 22 one more time. The open hands, the release, the extraordinary stillness of what comes after you finally let the weight go. She had flown to London in a seat she had earned, been told by a woman in a designer coat that she did not belong there, stood in the aisle of a first-class cabin with nothing but the truth, and refused to sit down until it was heard. Drawn the face of the woman who tried to diminish her and found grief in it, watched her mother walk through a curtain and change the terms of what an airline was required to be, and 4 days later hung 22 pieces of her life's work on the walls of a Mayfair gallery, where a woman who had loved someone for 48 years found in a painting of empty hands the exact shape of everything she was trying to understand. Maya Clark had not wandered into any room that was not already hers. She had simply arrived before the world was ready, and then she had stayed, and then she had made something so undeniable that the world had no choice but to make room.